Hi, everyone. This is the lectures 4 and 5 on the U.S. Congress. I'm going to split this up in several parts. I'm going to skip all of the agenda and announcement stuff, but be sure that you do check the slides, make sure you check the dates and things um, as you would normally, but that's just a quick reminder. Any announcements will come out in the Canvas announcements. Um, Today I'm going to cover Congress uh, 4 and 5. I say today. Hopefully, I get through these all today and get them posted. Um, I'm going to split this up into 3 parts, I think. We'll start with constitutional powers and organization of Congress. Then I'll cover bills and laws. And then last, I'll cover a little bit about congressional rules and operation and the relationship to the other branches. Um, so I'll post 3 different lectures, parts 1, 2, and 3. Um, you are not obligated to watch these. These are for your benefit. So you don't have to watch them all the way through. That's the reason I'm splitting them up. But also, hopefully, you can, use whatever video player you use and actually find the specific part you need. If you have questions on anything or you just want it for review purposes. So constitutional powers and organization, starting out, the constitutional powers fall into 2 general categories, um, enumerated powers and implied powers. So enumerated powers are the things that are actually listed in the United States Constitution as belonging to Congress. The implied powers are just what they sound like. They're not actually listed in the Constitution, but based on the really small list that is in the Constitution, we can kind of assume that they're part of it. And there are some good examples of implied powers that make a lot of sense. And then there are some examples of implied powers that really don't make much sense. So I'll give you some examples of each. Um, so these come from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. If you have the lecture slides, you can click the link there and it will open up. And it's going to go to the Annenberg Guide to the U.S. Constitution, which is an annotated guide. So, first of all, this is the actual list of the powers from the Constitution. But then the Annenberg Guide also has this nice uh, annotation where they explain a little bit um, about these powers, and so it may overlap what I'm saying to you, but it may be good. Some of you may want to read that, and I really would. I suggested earlier in the semester. Um, well, I didn't really suggest. I said you were supposed to read the Constitution. The Constitution isn't that long. Um, this Annenberg Constitution Guide is really good if you get in there and some of the language maybe gets in your way. But this is the list. Um, so I'm not going to go through the full list, but I'm going to talk about some categories and some things that are in there. So first of all, there's this whole idea of the power of the purse. Purse is in the thing you put money in, right? Um, uh, you know, I guess at the time they wrote it, everyone carried a purse. Now we might say the power of the wallet, um, but that's what this is about. So this is the power to tax, the power to spend, and the power to borrow. The Constitution specifically gave Congress the power to tax, and this was really important. It was probably uh, well, it was definitely one of the top 2 or 3 reasons the Constitution was passed at all, because under the Articles of Confederation that existed during the Revolutionary War and up until the time of the Constitution, um, the states were really just a league of friendship. The central government had no power whatsoever in most areas, and it definitely didn't have the power to pass taxes. When the central government needed money, it had to ask the states for money, and the states, provided it grudgingly. And as a result, the central government had trouble paying its bills. Um, so the power to tax is in there. The power to spend. And so it talks broadly about different things that Congress can spend money on. And then Congress also was given the power to borrow on the credit of the United States. And so that's important. Um, there are several categories where there are these powers given to Congress to regulate things. And we don't actually see the word regulate here in this one in particular, but this is an example. But these powers of regulation that were given to Congress today, we think of regulation as we're going to shut this down, right? Environmental regulation. There's some company doing something we don't like. We're going to go shut them down. Um, Regulation, as it was used in the Constitution, was not about shutting things down. It was about encouraging things. Because what happened prior to the Constitution is that there were 13 different rules for everything. And you can imagine if you're trying to do business across state lines in all 13 states and there are 13 different rules for everything, that's a real headache. So giving the power to Congress to regulate these things and make one simple rule for all of it really encouraged business. And here's one example of that. Um, they give Congress the right to issue patents and copyrights, or to arrange for issuing patents and copyrights, to set up a patent office and a copyright office. Uh, and the whole point of this is it's to promote the progress of science and useful arts. So it's to you encourage inventions by giving the inventors a patent so that they can make money off of their invention. You encourage writers and painters and all kinds of other artists by giving them a copyright on their work so they can sell their work and make a living off of it. Uh, that's how you end up getting professional writers as opposed to just amateur writers. Um, so this is done in order to promote the thing. Congress is given the power to regulate it. Now, the next one is actually one where the phrase the word regulate is used, and this is the Commerce Clause, which is probably the most important clause in the enumerated powers. Congress is, except possibly the power to declare war. Um, Congress is given the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the states and with the Indian tribes. So regulate here is actually meant to promote. Prior to this, there were 13 different states, basically independent countries, all passing their own regulations on commerce with each other. So New York could pass laws that would make it hard for businesses from Virginia to sell in New York. Uh, and then Massachusetts could pass laws that would make it hard for New York to sell their stuff in Massachusetts. And by regulating commerce, this actually comes from the phrase, the same root word as to make regular. That is to make commerce ordinary, to make commerce regular, to make it happen all the time. It was to have more commerce, not to have less. So this is regulating in order to promote. And sometimes Congress, well, quite often Congress forgets that the purpose of the Commerce Clause was not to shut down commerce, that is business. It was to make more of it. So that's to regulate commerce is in there. So another one is to establish an uniform rule of naturalization. Now, the wording is from the U.S. Constitution. Congress had the power to establish a rule of naturalization, a way to become citizens of the United States. So here again, prior to this, there were 13 different rules for how you became a citizen. It was up to the states. There was no real rule on immigration. Immigration was considered a good thing. The purpose was, here again, to actually encourage people to immigrate to the United States and become citizens by making one rule. So naturalization is actually something that takes place after you've already come to the country, 5 years, 10 years, 7 years, 3 years. The rule varies, or the rule varied a lot, but Congress was going to put in one rule so that if someone came in to the United States, they knew how long it was going to be before they could become a citizen and what the rules would be for it. Um, the interesting thing is there's actually not anything in there about controlling immigration itself. So someone who just wanted to come to the United States and live here and not become a citizen, there really wasn't any limitation on that. It was almost 100 years before any serious attempt to actually limit immigration occurred, and that was with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a racist bill that denied any immigration to Chinese immigrants, targeted them specifically. Um, so, how do I know that this was intended to promote immigration and not to obstruct it? Well, the seventh grievance against the King of England in the Declaration of Independence. So this is from the Declaration of Independence. There was a list of all the things that had gone wrong, all the things the king had done that were the reasons that the United States rebelled against England. And one of them was he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states. For that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners. So he wasn't allowing foreigners to become citizens at all, and refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither. Uh, so, so one of the reasons the United States rebelled against England was because the King of England was making it hard for people to immigrate to the U.S. And so the founding fathers thought immigration was so important, it was one of the things that was worth fighting for. Uh, so, so Congress has this power to regulate naturalization, and actually, immigration is not an enumerated power. It's just an implied power. It's sort of implied by the power to regulate naturalization. Um, and so here again, though, this was to regulate in order to promote, not discourage. Um, there was the idea that we're going to have a single national standard. It might be higher than some of the states, but it's probably lower than most of the states. And the whole purpose of it was to follow through on the Declaration of Independence and populate, especially the frontier areas. So enumerated powers. We got the power of the purse. We've got the three big regulates where they're promoting things to regulate interstate commerce, regulate international intellectual property, and regulate naturalization. And then we have four other categories that have a lot to do with regulating interstate commerce, in that they're intended to promote business. So one is to coin money. Prior to this, any of the states could coin money, and sometimes even private banks could coin money. Um, and so most of the money were, dollar coins or some denomination of dollars, and a dollar was a specific weight of gold, was defined as a specific weight of gold. But the problem was with all these different, states and sometimes even private entities coining the gold, you didn't always know that you were actually getting the purity that you expected or the weight that you expected. By giving Congress the power to coin money, it allowed for a single national standard so that, and it didn't necessarily mean these other groups couldn't coin money, but it meant that if you got a US dollar from a US mint, you could rely on it as having the right amount of gold at the right purity. Um, Establishing uniform bankruptcy laws. So bankruptcy laws are all about somebody gets in debt, they can't pay it off, they're going to discharge their debt without paying it. Usually their assets are going to be sold and given to the creditors. Um, so this is a pro-debtor thing, but it also makes it easier for creditors. So that it makes it easier for the banks to do business because they know under what conditions the people can get out of paying their debts. And so it takes some of the risk out of it for banks. Even though it gives a way for people to get out of their debts, but it establishes a national uniform rule, um, and that makes things better for business. Um, Establishing post offices and post roads. Uh, so post offices and post roads, there weren't any national highways, there weren't any interstates, there weren't telegraphs even yet. So any kind of communication had to be done in writing and somebody had to deliver it. There had to be papers sent. So if you wanted to do business, long distance, you might have to send contracts, you might have to send letters in advance of somebody actually making the trip. And those post roads could be used not just by the post office, so those also help to improve communication and commerce between the states. Finally, establishing weights and measures. Here we're talking about, if you buy a pound of tobacco from Virginia or a pound of tobacco from South Carolina, you want them to be the same pound. If it's up to the states to regulate weights and measures, then one state can say, well, we're going to make ourselves look, we're going to make our stuff look better by defining the pound as a little bit less. And so our people will be able to charge a smaller price per pound, but the pound won't be the same as the other state. It made things very confusing, at least potentially. Um, Things could be very confusing. Having a single uniform standard meant that you knew what a pound was, you knew what an acre of land was, you knew what a foot was, and that's important in doing business. Today, it actually carries through to things like standards for telecommunications. Now, a lot of those are set privately, but there's some power for Congress to step in and say, hey, there are going to be some standards for how we define things in terms of standards for electronic communication. This is a related thing. Most of that gets done privately today, but there is some power for Congress to do it, and it's an actual enumerated power. So Congress also has the power to establish inferior courts. So any of the courts other than the Supreme Court, which is set up in the Constitution, any of the other courts are just Congress's power. Congress has passed laws that every court in the country at the federal level, from the district courts to the appellate courts, was established by Congress under the enumerated powers. So then there are the war powers. So the war powers are the power to declare war, the power to raise and support armies, the power to provide and maintain a navy, and then the power to make rules for the military. Um, these are important. The power to declare war hasn't been used since World War II because under the United Nations Charter, which we're a member of, declaring war is not legal. Um, War can only happen in self-defense. And so we've hesitated to declare war. Done things like authorizations to use military force, or the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was just a resolution, not a declaration of war. Um, so so that's uh, so that's blurred the distinction somewhat since the president is the commander in chief. Some of the things that have happened have been uh, sort of out of line with that. Presidents sending out troops on their own initiative in self-defense, but that's also an implied power of the commander in chief. Uh, so things have gotten complicated with the war powers, but the primary war powers for authorizing war and authorizing armies and navies and setting the rules is with Congress. Um, Governing the Capital District, the District of Columbia. So that's Washington, D.C. The Capital District was actually ceded to the federal government out of land from Maryland and Virginia. So it belongs to the federal government, but on loan from those two other states. And it's up to Congress to govern it. There's a big push for statehood for the District of Columbia, but that land actually belongs to the states of Maryland. Actually, I believe Maryland got their land back, but it belongs to the state of Virginia. And I may have that backwards, but it belongs to one of those two states, Virginia or Maryland. Um, so if the people of District of Columbia want statehood, really, they're already part of a state. Just because it was ceded to the federal government, they don't vote in congressional elections. If they're going to have statehood, um, the state that actually owns the land would have to sign off on it. And a lot of the statehood advocates don't think about that. But the whole reason that the District of Columbia was carved out of these states and made not a state was because it was assumed that most of the people that were working there, they were, the senators and congressmen and the president are citizens of whatever state they come from, and they do their voting there. But it was assumed that everybody else that was going to live there worked for the government. And remember, they had just fought a revolutionary war against this faraway government in London that taxed them for its own purposes and that treated them shabbily in a lot of ways. And so the idea was they wanted to limit the power of these. They didn't want these government workers to become all powerful. And one way to limit the power of the government workers was that they couldn't elect their own members of Congress. It kind of made sense. And given the fact that most of the people in the District of Columbia today rely on the government for their income, this is not necessarily a bad argument for why there should not be statehood for DC today. Um, at least the concept has to be considered before giving DC statehood. Um, so, what about these implied powers? The implied powers are these things. They come from this thing called the necessary and proper clause. It's also called the elastic clause. So you think about if you wear some pants that have an elastic waistband, and you eat too much, you don't have to unbuckle them because the waistband expands. That's the idea. That's why it's called the elastic clause. But it's technically the necessary and proper clause, which is because it's the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution and the government. So the thing is, they have these powers, this relatively small list of powers, but sometimes in order to make those things happen, they have to do other things. Um, the way that you would unbuckle your waistband with regard to the Constitution is you have to go through and make a constitutional amendment. And that's a fairly lengthy process. It's difficult to do. So you want this is the elastic waistband of the Constitution. Um, the requirements, though, in this are it's supposed to be necessary. So it's not that they're supposed to do something because it's convenient or because it makes it a little bit easier. It has to be necessary for carrying out their other powers, and it has to be proper. So it can't be abusive of other rights. I mean, at least that was the initial thing. But what's happened is it's become well, it's a little bit convenient, and it's only a little bit improper. So yeah, it's allowed. We don't really hold Congress to this necessary and proper. We tend to emphasize the elastic part. And so some examples of implied powers that were pretty seriously in there. Uh, well, the second one is an proper and necessary. The first one there was a lot of debate about the power to establish a national bank. And the idea was that this was implied by Congress's power to borrow. And the example was the Central Bank of England, the Bank of England. The Bank of England had been formed a couple hundred years before, I guess about 150 years before or so, and had made it much easier for the kings of England to borrow. And so there was this example of it had been really hard for the kings of England to borrow prior. Uh, the National Bank was established in England, and actually Parliament was able to borrow very easily. It made and it actually also did a lot of things. It encouraged commerce. It was a big thing that really helped England to grow economically. So it helped with some of the other powers too, like regulating commerce. Um, so it was implied, uh, but the first national bank there was a lot of opposition to, and when its charter expired, it ended up just becoming a state bank and then eventually going away a few decades later. But the second national bank, though, by the time of the second national bank, some of the opponents of the first national bank actually got on board and voted for it. But it too expired and didn't get renewed. And so this is all early 1800s before the Civil War. We didn't get another national bank until the Federal Reserve in 1913. but it's here to stay probably. Um, Another one's the power to establish a military draft. This one's really pretty simple. It's almost a no-brainer. Congress has the enumerated power to raise armies. How do you raise armies? There are two ways. You can pay mercenaries, or you can have a draft. Both of them were established standard ways that countries raised armies, and countries that were in serious wars almost always had a draft. So it seemed like a no-brainer, at least, that having a draft is strongly implied by the power to raise armies. So what about Actually, I'm going to back up. What about an example of something that's not so obviously implied? So the Commerce Clause gives Congress the power to regulate commerce between states, between Missouri and Texas, between Virginia and California. Congress has no power under the Constitution, or very limited power, to regulate commerce within states. Within Texas, that's up to Texas to regulate. Within Missouri, that's up to Missouri to regulate. Within Virginia, it's up to Virginia. But Congress has used the Commerce Clause to regulate so that if someone grows a cannabis plant in their backyard for their own personal use, they don't even share it with anybody within the state. It's strictly for their own personal use. The Supreme Court has ruled that that affects interstate commerce, and so Congress can regulate it. That's one example. Another example, insurance of all types is strictly a state matter, has been since the founding, has always been regulated by the states. If you form an insurance company, that's regulated by the states. If you get a license to sell insurance, that's regulated by the states. The contracts, the rules, the regulations, they're all state rules until the Affordable Care Act came along and began heavily regulating insurance. Um, and again, they relied on the Commerce Clause. The Supreme Court in that case said, well, you can't really rely on the Commerce Clause because this is not interstate commerce. These are strictly state level deals. But the court uh, said it's still okay though because the penalties are just taxes. They're not fines, and Congress has the power to tax. So Congress tried to use the Commerce Clause. The Supreme Court came to their rescue and said, it's okay, you have the power to tax. Um, so constitutional organization, the House of Representatives, this is in Article 1, Section 2. The membership is set by population. There are currently 435 members. That's probably not going to change. So it's roughly even population, 435 districts across the country. Congress people are elected for 2-year terms. They have to be at least 25 years old. They have to have been a citizen of the United States for 7 years, and they have to be a resident of the state they represent. They don't actually have to be a resident of the district they represent. So somebody from Dallas could represent Houston as long as they're a resident of the state. Realistically, that is not going to happen because Houstonians wouldn't elect a Cowboys fan. But, you know, it's legal. On the other hand, and so I'll give you the constitutional powers of the House. They have the power to originate revenue bills. So the power of the purse starts in the House of Representatives. Revenue bills are the bills related to taxation. They have the power to impeach federal officials, so that is to bring impeachment charges. All that impeachment is a list of charges. It's comparable to an indictment in a criminal case. And they have the power to elect the president in case of a tie in the Electoral College, and they do it on the basis of one vote per state. That has happened a couple of times. Article 1, Section 3 gives the organization of the Senate. The Senate, there are 2 from each state, so they have much bigger districts. There are about 730,000 people in a congressional district. The senators from the state of Texas represent like 28 million people. Um, Much bigger districts in most cases. Now, there are some states that have one congressperson and two senators um, because the state population is that small. They serve 6 year terms. They have to be 30 years old. They have to have been citizen for 9 years instead of seven. Now, 30 instead of 25. They have to be a resident of the state they represent. Only a third of them are elected every 2 years, so there's never a complete turnover. Um, and the Vice President of the United States is the President of the Senate, which is the only constitutional power of the Vice President. The only thing the Vice President of the United States can do under the Constitution as a power is preside over the Senate. Um, so they have to be older. They go longer between elections. They have to have been a citizen longer. Um, these are all intended to make the Senate the more sober, deliberative, thoughtful body that takes its time, that doesn't do things that seem like a good idea but really aren't. It's to slow down the process. Constitutional powers of the Senate, they get to try cases of impeachment. So the House of Representatives brings the charges, and then the sober, deliberative, thoughtful Senate actually tries the cases. They sit as the court. Uh, they have to give advice and consent to any treaties and most foreign policy actions of the president. So this is important. And then they also give advice and consent to presidential appointments. So the executive branch appointments in the cabinet, the ambassadors, all the other officials, and then the judicial branch appointments. So all of the judges of the United States are appointed by the president, approved by the Senate, and they serve a life term. Um, a life term in a good way. They get to be judges for life and get a paycheck. Um, so, so that's important that they have to give advice and consent to these things. Uh, I'm going to pause here or stop here. You'll get part 2 on bills and laws in a separate recording.